Welcome to our next guest, Craig Stobo, who has moved into, I have to say, a very calm, sophisticated place at the moment. You're in Queenstown, Craig, is that right?
Yes, just flew in about an hour ago, so sunny and a little bit cooler than Auckland, but nowhere near as humid. So wonderful to be here.
No, it's good to be down the south again. Mind you come from the south, don't you? So it's a bit like returning home, is it?
It is. I was surprised to hear Chris Trotter was born or raised on a small farm, or a farm, another small, but a farm south of Oamaru. I didn't realise he had roots in North Otago, which is another reason for me to catch up with him for a cup of coffee, I think.
Yeah, no, he's and he's a good guy, Chris. In actual fact, he used to be an old-fashioned lefty. I think they've pretty much disabused him now of that concept, hasn't he? Or do you think old-fashioned socialists did have moral principles and values, and they're out of fashion at the moment, Craig?
I think he's just expressing disenchantment with the way the party that he knew and loved has changed, and I think he would like it to go back to its roots. Would be my surmise, but that's a conversation I think for you and him to have at some point.
Yes, well, we will. All right, now over the last week, moving into it was really interesting, actually. In fact, this argument over police recruiting numbers is just a microscopic debate, I would assume. You know how Wellington works at budget time, Craig. I would imagine that Treasury at the moment, and Nicola Willis in particular, constrained by our economic circumstances, is trying to rein in a whole series of spending by a whole series of departments whose ministers promised a whole series of changes. Difficult tension time at the moment, you would think, as they're putting a budget together.
Yeah, so under National's 100-day plan, which survived the coalition negotiations, there is a promise of tax cuts via threshold changes, income tax threshold changes, and some expenditure via working for family tax credits. Now that's about $3 billion odd. It's got to be funded from somewhere, and some of those funding mechanisms didn't survive the coalition negotiations. So the Treasurer, the Finance Minister, Nicola Willis, has to fund that in addition to trying to get to better quality spending. So the number on the table before the election was around 6.5% cuts to public service provision in different forms, presumably middle back office still, but consultants and the like. But my understanding is some entities have been asked for 7.5% tax cuts. So there's quite a bit of tension around spending programs. That may have been why Mark Mitchell raised what he did, but I suspect a bigger issue for the police force is just trying to get the numbers, trying to find those recruits in the next 2 years in a pretty tight labour market, really, with competition from Australia. So looks like they're going to stick to their target over 2 years, which means somehow they've got to attract those those recruits to go to the Pororua Police College.
But the other thing is the wider picture that you've alluded to is finding the $3 billion for the tax cuts. I noticed that the Australian government, and have you caught up with what Albanese and the Australians did last week, Chris, with their tax changes? Oh, sorry, Craig?
No, just take me through that, sorry.
Albanese last week, last Thursday, about this time last week, the Australians have changed their tax rates around essentially to make sure that the lower and middle income folk have more money at the expense of those earning income of over, I think, $150,000 Australian a year. So typical, left of centre government, if you're going to change around with the tax rates, you're going to make sure that people at the bottom end have more money and that those at the end have less, those at the top have less. Nicola Willis doesn't have that card to play, though, does she? She's not going to adjust the 39 cents in the dollar.
No, but it's a threshold. So the rate at which higher income tax rates come in is going to be lifted. So that was the back pocket kind of promise through the election. So in a sense, it does provide some dollars for lower and middle income New Zealanders. Is it enough? Well, that's probably a question of quantum, obviously, but it does try and target lower and middle income. So it is an opportunity to try and put some cash back in sort of cope with cost of living issues, which, as you know, aren't going away.
Well, can I just on that, just before we move from that one, earlier this week I was talking to the chief economist at the New Zealand Business Initiative to do with David Seymour's speech, and him saying, well, instead of having 5 tax rates, have 3, and deal with it this way. Did you have the opportunity to have a look at that?
Yeah, well, David's a fan of a less progressive tax system and lower and flatter rates on the basis that you bring more people into the income tax net because it's more attractive to work because your after-tax pay is higher. There's a real problem for us here, though, which I know Treasury is concerned about, but we don't get any airtime on it. I've spoken once or twice about it on your program, but the Working for Families tax credit system is enormously complicated and inhibits the people accepting going to work. So no one in the coalition is willing to tackle this, but we need to talk about it. 350,000 Kiwis on Working for Families. Some won't go into higher tax brackets because they have much higher tax rates. Some have got debt owing to the IRD. You know, we're digging a real hole for ourselves here, but we're not talking about in policy terms and trying to find ways to go back to a more transparent, simpler system. So it's not just a flatter tax rate, it's actually Working for Families tax credit also needs to be addressed.
No, I agree with you. And as somebody who actually has to work out all these things themselves and see if they qualify and finds that they don't, sadly, it is a very complicated system that doesn't actually, on a weekly basis, assist you until the end of the tax year, does it? That's one way.
That's one way, yeah. But there's MSC and IRD departments involved. It's incredibly difficult, I would have thought, for people trying to understand whether they're eligible and making sure they stay on track.
That's right.
Understanding tax obligations. But it's an awful system.
Yes, it is. Do you think Nicola Willis is going to deliver this budget, or do you think she's going to say, we're not in the economics place we need to be for me to do so?
No, I think she's made the promise, and the tax threshold back pocket type tax plan will go ahead. She'll just have to find the savings required to do that. Of course, that means that the opportunity for looking at quality expenditures through programs, it almost needs to be a parallel piece of work that won't be put in place by June. Well, I think it's April to June period when the promised threshold numbers come in. But I think she'll find that cash, but it's more a case of rectifying the primary deficit before interest costs over the next 3 years, try and bring that back to surplus, and to start getting on top of our public debt issuance, try and rein that in.
Yeah, good luck on the latter one. I can see the argument in actual fact, Craig, because I know exactly what she's going to say on budget day. She's going to say, and we think that these tax changes will boost the economy, bring more people into work, and therefore we're going to get that additional revenue from the economy being generated and more people in work and more tax being paid, yeah?
Yeah, you have to be a bit careful around the fiscal policy stance. The chief economist at the Reserve Bank, Paul Conway, gave a very good speech earlier on this week, noting that one of the reasons for GDP coming off as it did lower than expected in the September year was reducing government expenditures. And that's helpful in some ways for monetary policy. But if fiscal policy remains, relatively symmetry through the tax cuts regime, you've got to be careful that Reserve Bank may say, well, we don't have much room to cut rates. As it stands, that speech was very helpful, outlining some of the contradictions of the data that's coming out. So while government expenditure came off, private sector demand and business investment was actually revised up. And of course, he has explicitly mentioned, as you have, the impact of migration, net migration numbers of around 130,000 people coming into the country, which increases rents and construction costs and ultimately means higher rates for local authorities who've got to provide the network services to enable these people to find, live in existing or new places. So, it does seem to me that, as Paul Conway said, and I've been saying for a few weeks now, that there's not going to be any change to the OCR, the official cash rate, till at least June. I would have thought the phrase that he used was, there's a way to go to get inflation back to the middle of the band, which is 2%. So, markets have been hoping for a rate cut earlier than that. It's just not going to happen, given the speech that's just been delivered.
No, fair point, Craig. Listen, the briefing papers to the ministers have just been released this morning, actually probably while you're on the plane, actually. So that's the, 3-yearly cycle where the new minister comes in, briefing papers provided to them to say, well, this is the state of the land as we see it in our department, and these are the issues, and those have been publicly released this morning. One of the things that intrigued me here, Craig, is, and we speak very little about it, is the number of people who are receiving a welfare benefit in this country. And the point is that the percentage of working age population on a main benefit has actually increased. That's in the briefing papers from the department to the incoming Minister, I think, of Social Welfare, Louise Upston. There are currently 362,000 people receiving a main benefit. And this is up 16,000, or 4.7% compared to the year previous. You wouldn't have thought in the last year, would you, from September to September, that you'd see such a significant increase in benefit, given the amount of money that was there and the amount of jobs sloshing around in the last 12 months, Craig?
Yeah, well, the unemployment rate's below 4%, so the economy is kind of steaming along. It's just surprising that and a labour shortage is that we've experienced during and after lockdown, because we didn't have the migration, that those people weren't able to be enticed into jobs. And that's with the minimum wage rising, living wage rising, etc. So quite why those people won't accept jobs because of location or skills, motivation. I don't know what that is, but that's a heavy impost on public finances when private sector in particular is looking for staff.